Everyone in the valley laughed when the veteran started digging a trench across his yard. Until the night a deadly blizzard buried the town, and that strange trench became the only thing standing between life and death. Ethan Cole had returned from war carrying wounds no one could see. Deep in the Rocky Mountains, he tried to live quietly on an old ranch with the only partner who truly understood him, his loyal German shepherd, Atlas. When winter began creeping down the mountains, Ethan started digging a long trench from his cabin to the barn. The neighbors said the war had broken him, but Ethan and Atlas kept digging. And when the coldest storm in years finally arrived, the whole valley would learn that the man they mocked might have been the only one who truly understood the mountain winter. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from today? The wind in the Rockies never truly stopped. It moved through the valley like something alive, sliding through the pine trees, brushing over the frozen creek, whispering across the empty pastures around the old Cole property. Some nights it sounded like distant voices. Other nights it sounded like the low thrum of helicopter blades. Ethan Cole knew the difference. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, his mind did not. The small log cabin sat alone at the edge of a wide clearing outside the mountain town of Silver Creek, Colorado. The place had once belonged to a rancher who'd given up after 2 brutal winters and sold the land cheap. Most folks in town figured the mountains had won. Ethan hadn't cared about the history. He just wanted quiet. When he first arrived that late spring, the snow was still melting in long, gray patches beneath the pines. The cabin smelled like dust and old wood. The barn leaned slightly to one side, its red paint faded almost to brown. Beyond it stretched a rough pasture, and farther still, the endless dark line of the Rocky Mountains. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear without anyone asking too many questions. That suited Ethan just fine. He stepped down from his truck and looked over the property for a long time without speaking. Beside him, a large German shepherd jumped out of the passenger seat and landed softly in the dirt. The dog's name was Atlas. Atlas stood tall and alert, ears upright, dark eyes scanning the quiet landscape like he was still on patrol. His coat was thick, black and tan, scarred in places from years of hard work. Years before, Atlas had been a military working dog. So had Ethan. The two of them had served together overseas. The kind of work they did didn't make headlines. Most days it involved long, dusty roads, slow patrols, and listening carefully for the one sound that didn't belong. Atlas had been trained to find explosives. More than once, that training had saved Ethan's life. And when Ethan finally left the army, Atlas had left with him. Now the two of them stood in the thin mountain sunlight, staring at a future that looked as quiet and empty as the land itself. Ethan rested one hand gently on the dog's neck. "Well," he said quietly, "this is home now." Atlas didn't answer, of course, but his tail gave a slow, steady wag. Inside the cabin, the rooms were small but solid. Thick log walls, a stone fireplace, and a cast-iron stove near the center of the main room. The windows looked out toward the barn and the open yard between them. About 70 feet separated the two buildings. At the time, Ethan barely noticed the distance. He carried in supplies, stacked firewood along the back wall, and laid a worn rug near the stove, where Atlas immediately curled up. For the first few days, the silence felt like relief. No traffic, no radios, no shouting, just wind and birds and the soft creak of old wood settling in the sun. But night was different. The first time it happened, Ethan woke up suddenly with his heart hammering against his ribs. The cabin was dark. The wind outside had picked up, pushing against the walls in long, low gusts. Somewhere, a loose board rattled against the barn. For a few seconds, Ethan didn't know where he was. In his mind, he heard rotors beating overhead, voices shouting through a headset, the sharp metallic snap of distant gunfire. His breathing turned quick and shallow. Then something warm nudged his hand. Atlas. The dog had already lifted his head from the rug. His ears were forward, his body calm but alert. Slowly, he rested his chin on Ethan's arm. The simple weight of it brought Ethan back. The cabin came into focus again. The smell of wood smoke, the faint glow of the dying stove. No helicopters, no explosions, just wind in the mountains. Ethan exhaled slowly and rubbed the dog's head. "Yeah," he murmured. "I know. Just the wind." Atlas stayed there until Ethan's breathing settled again. That became their routine. Most nights Ethan slept well enough. But some nights the wind carried memories with it, and the past slipped quietly into the present. When it did, Atlas was always there first, steady and silent, reminding his partner that the war was thousands of miles away. Days were easier. Ethan spent them repairing the property. He straightened part of the fence line, patched the barn roof, and cleared brush from the edge of the field. Atlas followed him everywhere, trotting ahead sometimes as if inspecting the land. In town, people began noticing the new resident. Silver Creek wasn't the kind of place where strangers stayed anonymous for long. At the general store, a few locals mentioned the veteran who'd bought the old coal ranch. Most assumed he wouldn't last a year. The Rockies had a way of testing people. Winters came early up there, and when they came hard. But Ethan didn't pay much attention to the talk in town. Every morning he stepped outside with a cup of black coffee, watching mist rise from the trees as the sun climbed over the mountains. Atlas usually sat beside him on the porch, nose lifted to the cold air. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something close to peace. Still, even in early autumn, the wind carried a warning. The mountains were patient. They waited. And winter, in the Rockies, was never far away. Ethan would learn soon enough that the quiet land he'd chosen for refuge had its own rules, and that surviving here would require more than thick walls and a warm fire. It would require understanding the mountain itself. And that lesson would begin with something as simple and as dangerous as 70 feet of open ground. For the first few weeks after moving to the ranch, Ethan Cole barely noticed the distance between the cabin and the barn. 70 feet of packed dirt and gravel stretched between them, worn down by the boots of the rancher who'd owned the place before him. In the mild autumn sun, it seemed almost laughably short. You could walk it in less than 15 seconds. On calm mornings, Ethan would carry a bucket of grain out to the barn while Atlas trotted beside him, tail swinging lazily. The old barn doors creaked when he pulled them open, revealing the quiet interior where 2 horses now lived. Ethan had bought them cheap from a rancher who was moving south before winter. The animals snorted softly when they saw him coming. Atlas always entered the barn first, nose down, circling once like a careful guard checking the perimeter. It was a habit from another life, one he had never quite forgotten. Ethan watched him with a faint smile. "Still working, huh?" he muttered. Atlas's ears flicked in response. Those early weeks were peaceful. The sky stayed clear most days, and the air smelled sharp with pine and dry grass. But every now and then, the wind rolled down from the mountains with a colder edge. Ethan noticed the change. The mornings began frosting the ground. The creek behind the pasture grew slower and quieter. The mountains on the horizon turned white along their upper ridges. Winter was gathering itself. One evening in late October, Ethan stepped outside after sunset to check the barn. Atlas padded ahead of him through the yard, his dark shape moving easily through the growing dusk. The wind had started again. It slid down the valley in long, cold currents that rattled the barn siding and whispered through the pine trees like distant breath. Halfway across the yard, Ethan stopped. Something about the sound made his chest tighten. The wind rushed past his ears in a deep, chopping rhythm. For a moment, it sounded exactly like rotor blades. The memory hit him hard. Desert dust. The roar of helicopters landing too close. Someone shouting over the radio. Ethan's breathing shortened. Atlas noticed immediately. The dog turned, stepping back toward him, pressing gently against his leg. The contact was enough to pull Ethan back to the present. Cold mountain air filled his lungs. No desert, no helicopters. Just the ranch. "Easy," Ethan murmured, rubbing the dog's neck. "I'm good." Atlas stayed close as they finished crossing the yard. Inside the barn, the horses shifted in their stalls. Ethan checked their water trough and scattered fresh hay. The barn smelled warm compared to the night outside, filled with the quiet breath and body heat of the animals. For a moment, Ethan simply stood there listening. It was calm inside. But when he stepped back out into the yard, the wind hit him like a wall. The temperature had dropped fast. The air burned against his face, and the short walk back to the cabin suddenly felt longer than it had that morning. Atlas moved closer to his side. The wind kept rising. By the time they reached the porch, Ethan's fingers were stiff inside his gloves. He glanced back toward the barn. 70 feet, not far. But something about the way the wind moved across that open space unsettled him. He didn't say anything about it. Not yet. 2 weeks later, the first real storm arrived. It came down from the mountains overnight, dragging thick gray clouds across the valley and burying the ranch beneath a blanket of heavy snow. By morning, the world outside the cabin had turned white. Ethan stepped onto the porch, boots crunching into the fresh snow. Atlas bounded ahead into the yard, sending powder flying around his paws. The air felt sharper now, colder. The wind hadn't stopped all night. Ethan looked toward the barn. The familiar 70 feet had vanished beneath drifts of snow that curved and twisted across the yard like frozen waves. Atlas barked once and began trotting toward the barn. "Hold up!" Ethan called, pulling his coat tighter. They started across together. The snow reached halfway up Ethan's boots. Each step sank deeper than the last. Halfway across the yard, the wind gusted suddenly, blasting a cloud of powder across his face. He turned his head, squinting. For a moment, he lost sight of the barn entirely. Atlas stopped and looked back. The dog seemed to understand the danger in a way Ethan couldn't quite explain. His body angled into the wind, ears flattened as he waited. Ethan pushed forward. By the time they reached the barn doors, his cheeks burned from the cold and his fingers had begun to ache. Inside, the warmth from the horses felt almost shocking. He stood there for a moment, catching his breath. Atlas shook snow from his coat and paced the barn floor, restless. Ethan glanced back toward the cabin through the open doorway. The snow had already begun filling the tracks they'd made across the yard. The wind howled harder. 70 feet. That was all it was. But in a storm like this, it might as well have been a mile. Later that night, the temperature dropped even further. Ethan woke up before dawn to the sound of the barn doors slamming against their hinges. The wind had turned violent. Atlas was already on his feet. Ethan pulled on his boots and grabbed a lantern. "We better check on them," he said. Outside, the storm had grown worse. The wind slammed into him so hard he had to lean forward just to walk. Snow blasted sideways through the darkness, stinging his face and filling his eyes. Halfway to the barn, Ethan stumbled. The ground beneath the snow had frozen into uneven ridges, and his boot caught hard on something buried beneath the drift. He dropped to one knee. The wind roared past his ears. For a moment, he couldn't see the cabin behind him or the barn ahead. Just white. Atlas barked sharply and rushed back to him, grabbing the sleeve of Ethan's coat and tugging. "All right," Ethan muttered, forcing himself up. They pushed forward together. By the time they reached the barn, Ethan's hands were numb and his ears rang from the cold. Inside, the horses stomped nervously in their stalls. Ethan latched the barn doors tightly and stood there breathing hard. Atlas sat beside him, watching quietly. Ethan looked toward the cabin again. 70 feet. That short walk had nearly taken him down. If the storm had been any stronger, if he'd fallen a second time. The thought lingered longer than he liked. Atlas nudged his hand again. Ethan rubbed the dog's head slowly. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I see the problem now." Outside, the wind screamed across the yard like a warning. And somewhere in Ethan's mind, an idea had already begun to form. He didn't say it out loud. Not at first. The storm eventually passed, leaving the ranch buried beneath a quiet, white stillness. Snow hung thick on the pine branches, and the sky cleared into a pale winter blue that looked almost harmless after the violence of the night before. But Ethan remembered the walk. He remembered the wind, the moment he couldn't see the cabin or the barn. The sudden realization that 70 feet of open ground could turn dangerous in seconds. That thought stayed with him. The next morning, after feeding the horses, Ethan stood in the yard staring at the stretch of snow between the two buildings. Atlas stood beside him, ears forward, watching the same empty space. 70 feet, Ethan muttered. Atlas tilted his head. Ethan knelt down and brushed a section of snow away with his glove, revealing the frozen dirt underneath. He ran his fingers along the ground thoughtfully. The idea came from somewhere deep in his memory. From training exercises. From forward operating bases carved into hillsides overseas. From lessons about cold weather survival and how the earth itself could protect you if you knew how to use it. He stood up slowly. Atlas wagged his tail once. "Well," Ethan said quietly, "guess we've got some digging to do." The next afternoon, Ethan drove into Silver Creek. The town was small enough that most people noticed when someone new came through. The truck rumbled to a stop outside the hardware store, tires crunching over the icy gravel lot. Inside, the smell of lumber, metal, and old coffee filled the air. A few locals stood near the counter talking about the storm. Their conversation paused when Ethan stepped in. That happened a lot. Ethan kept his head down and grabbed a shovel from the rack, along with a heavy pickaxe and several bundles of wooden stakes. Atlas followed closely behind him, nails clicking softly against the wooden floor. At the counter, the store owner, an older man named Bill Carver, raised an eyebrow. "Planning on doing some serious work up there?" Bill asked. "Something like that," Ethan replied. Bill glanced out the window toward the mountains. "Winter's just getting started," he said. "Ground's gonna freeze hard soon." Ethan nodded once. "Yeah," he said. "That's why I'm starting now." The men near the stove watched quietly as Ethan paid for his supplies and headed back outside. Atlas jumped into the truck bed while Ethan loaded the tools. As the truck pulled away, one of the men shook his head slowly. "That the vet who bought the old coal place?" Bill nodded. "Yep." "What's he digging for in weather like this?" Bill shrugged. "Your guess is as good as mine." Back at the ranch, Ethan started the next morning. He marked a straight line from the cabin door to the barn entrance using the wooden stakes and a long stretch of twine. The string cut through the snowy yard like a quiet boundary. Atlas trotted back and forth along the line, sniffing the ground curiously. "Right here," Ethan said. He drove the shovel into the frozen earth. The ground fought back immediately. Even with the pickaxe, the first few inches were stubborn and hard. Ethan worked slowly, chipping away at the frost layer before shoveling out the packed soil beneath. Atlas began digging beside him, paws flinging loose dirt behind him in quick bursts. Ethan chuckled under his breath. "Guess you're helping." By midday, the trench had grown several feet long. It wasn't wide yet, just a narrow channel cutting through the yard. But the line was clear now, stretching from cabin to barn like the beginning of something unusual. A passing truck slowed on the road near the property. The driver leaned out the window for a better look. From the road, it appeared that a man and a German shepherd were digging a long ditch straight through the middle of their yard. The next day, another truck slowed. Then another. Silver Creek wasn't a place where strange projects stayed unnoticed for long. Within a week, people were talking. At the diner, someone mentioned the veteran digging trenches in the snow. At the gas station, someone else said he'd seen the dog helping. And by the end of the week, the story had taken on a life of its own. "The war messed him up," one rancher said over coffee. "Poor guy's digging a bunker or something." Another man laughed. "Looks more like he's digging his own grave." The rumors spread faster than the work itself. But Ethan didn't seem to notice. Day after day, he kept digging. The trench slowly deepened. 2 feet. 3 feet. Atlas stayed beside him through it all, leaping down into the trench to investigate whenever Ethan stepped away. Sometimes the dog would sit at the bottom of the ditch, looking up at Ethan like he was waiting for the next command. The work was slow, but steady. Cold air filled Ethan's lungs while the mountains watched silently from the horizon. One afternoon, as Ethan shoveled another load of dirt onto the growing piles beside the trench, a pickup truck rolled up the gravel road toward the ranch. It stopped near the fence. A tall man stepped out. Rick Dalton. Rick owned the largest cattle ranch outside Silver Creek. He had the broad shoulders and sunburned face of someone who had spent his entire life outdoors. He leaned against the truck door and looked over the yard. Then he started laughing. Ethan rested the shovel handle against his shoulder and waited. Rick walked closer, boots crunching through the snow. "What in the world are you doing, Cole?" he called out. Ethan glanced down at the trench. "Digging?" Rick grinned. "Yeah, I can see that." He kicked some loose dirt with his boot. "You building a graveyard or something?" Atlas stepped up beside Ethan, ears alert. Rick noticed the dog and raised his hand slightly. "Relax," he said. "Just asking." Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold air. "It's a trench," he said simply. Rick looked at the line stretching across the yard. "A trench," he repeated. Then he laughed again. "Well," he said, shaking his head, "if that's how you want to spend your winter." He climbed back into his truck and drove away, still smiling. Ethan watched the truck disappear down the road. Then he picked up the shovel again. Atlas returned to digging beside him. Above them, the mountains stood quiet and indifferent. The trench kept growing. And though the town of Silver Creek believed they were watching a man slowly lose his mind, Ethan Cole was building something very different. But in the town of Silver Creek, nobody believed that. Word about the trench traveled quickly through the valley. Small towns had their own rhythm of information. A single strange sight could pass from the diner to the gas station, from the church steps to the back tables of the general store before noon. By the end of the week, nearly everyone in Silver Creek had heard about the veteran digging a long ditch through his yard. Some thought it was sad. Others thought it was funny. Most thought it was pointless. At the Rusty Spur Diner, a group of ranchers sat around their usual table near the front window. Outside, trucks rolled slowly past the snow-covered streets while steam fogged the diner glass. Rick Dalton sat with his coffee mug resting in one broad hand. "I drove by the coal place yesterday," he said. Across the table, another rancher looked up. "That the vet who bought the old property?" Rick nodded. "Same one." He leaned back in the booth, shaking his head with a grin. "Man's out there digging a trench straight across his yard. Must be 50 or 60 feet long already." A few men chuckled. "What for?" someone asked. Rick lifted his shoulders. "Beats me. Maybe he thinks he's still in Afghanistan." More laughter. The waitress poured more coffee. "Maybe he's building himself a bunker," another man joked. "Or a grave," Rick said. The table erupted again. But not everyone joined in. At a smaller table near the window, a woman named Maggie Lawson quietly stirred her tea while listening to the conversation. Maggie lived about a mile down the road from Ethan's ranch. Her husband had died years earlier in a logging accident, leaving her to run the small property alone. She had seen Ethan only a few times, but she had seen the dog. That alone told her something. German shepherds trained for military work were not ordinary animals. Maggie had grown up around ranch dogs her whole life. She knew the difference between a companion and a partner. Atlas was something else entirely. She remembered the first time she had driven past the ranch and seen the two of them working. The man had been digging. The dog had been watching the hills. Not playing, watching. That kind of discipline didn't come from madness. It came from training. Still, Maggie didn't interrupt the conversation. In towns like Silver Creek, people preferred their conclusions simple. Across the valley, Ethan continued working. The trench had grown deeper now, nearly 4 feet in places. Piles of frozen dirt rose along each side like narrow walls. Atlas moved easily in and out of the trench, sometimes jumping down beside Ethan, sometimes patrolling the edges of the yard as if guarding the project. On a cold afternoon, Ethan climbed out of the ditch and stretched his aching back. Atlas immediately trotted over. "You're not tired yet?" Ethan asked. Atlas wagged his tail once. The dog's breath curled in the cold air. Ethan wiped his gloves against his jeans and looked down the length of the trench. The line was straight, precise. The kind of straight line a military engineer might measure with careful patience. 70 feet from cabin door to barn. The trench now covered nearly half the distance. Ethan rested the shovel across his shoulder and stared at the barn. The memory of that stormy night still lingered in his mind. The wind, the snow, the moment when he couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. He knew the next storm would be worse. Winter was only beginning. Atlas suddenly stiffened. His ears lifted toward the road. A vehicle approached. A pickup truck slowed beside the fence and stopped. Maggie Lawson stepped out. Ethan watched her walk across the snowy ground toward the trench. She wore a heavy wool coat and carried a thermos in one hand. Atlas studied her carefully, but didn't bark. "Afternoon?" Maggie called. "Afternoon," Ethan replied. She stopped beside the trench and looked down at it for several seconds. "That's quite a project," she said. Ethan nodded once. "Something like that." Maggie knelt and picked up a handful of dirt from the edge of the trench. 4 feet deep already," she said thoughtfully. She looked back toward the barn. "You planning to take it all the way across?" "Yeah." Maggie stood and brushed the dirt from her gloves. Most people in town would have laughed. She didn't. Instead, she handed him the thermos. "Coffee," she said. "Figured you might need it." Ethan hesitated for a moment before accepting it. "Thanks." She nodded toward Atlas. "That's your partner?" Ethan glanced down at the dog. "Best one I've ever had." Atlas sat quietly between them, watching both humans with calm eyes. Maggie studied the trench again. "You know," she said slowly, "most folks in town think you're digging something crazy." Ethan took a sip of coffee. "Probably." Maggie tilted her head slightly. "But I've seen trained dogs before," she said. "They don't stick around fools." Ethan didn't answer. He simply looked back toward the barn. After a moment, Maggie climbed back into her truck. As she drove away, Atlas returned to the edge of the trench. Ethan finished the coffee and set the thermos down. Then he picked up the shovel again. Across the valley, laughter about the trench continued. But out here, beneath the cold winter sky of the Rocky Mountains, Ethan Cole and his dog kept digging. And with every foot of frozen earth they removed, the strange project in the middle of the yard began to look less like a mistake, and more like the beginning of something no one in Silver Creek yet understood. The trench grew deeper with each passing day. By early December, the line of frozen earth stretching across Ethan Cole's yard had turned into something unmistakable. It was no longer a shallow ditch. Now it was a true trench, carved straight through the frozen ground like a scar across the land. 5 feet deep in some places, 4 feet wide, and still growing. The work was slow, back-breaking, and cold. Each swing of the pickaxe struck frozen soil that fought him every inch of the way. The mountain air had turned sharp enough to sting the lungs, and the wind rarely gave him a full hour of quiet. But Ethan kept going. Atlas never left his side. If Ethan stepped down into the trench, Atlas jumped in after him. If Ethan climbed out to stretch his back, Atlas followed. Sometimes the dog would run ahead along the trench line, scanning the hills the way he had once scanned dusty roads in another country. Old habits. On a gray afternoon, Ethan paused to catch his breath and leaned on the shovel handle. Atlas stood beside him in the trench, looking up with patient eyes. "Still with me, huh?" Ethan said. The dog's tail thumped once against the dirt wall. The quiet moment didn't last long. A sudden gust of wind tore across the valley, carrying with it a sound that Ethan hadn't heard clearly in months. A deep, chopping rhythm. For a split second, his mind left Colorado. The trench disappeared. The mountains vanished. All he saw was dust. All he heard was the beating roar of helicopter blades above a desert road. His breathing stopped. His hands tightened on the shovel until his knuckles went white. The memory came rushing back in fragments. A convoy stalled on a narrow road, shouting over radios. Someone yelling the word, "Incoming." Ethan's vision narrowed. He felt the old pressure in his chest, the one that made the world feel suddenly smaller and more dangerous. Atlas reacted instantly. The dog stepped closer and nudged Ethan's arm with his nose. Ethan didn't respond. The wind screamed across the trench. Atlas barked sharply. The sound cut through the fog in Ethan's mind. The mountains returned. The cold air rushed back into his lungs. Ethan blinked hard and forced himself to focus on the dirt wall in front of him. Atlas stayed close, pressing his body gently against Ethan's leg. "I'm okay," Ethan muttered after a moment. But his voice was quieter than he intended. The dog didn't move away. Instead, Atlas sat down right there in the trench, watching Ethan carefully, waiting for the moment when his breathing slowed again. That had happened before, more than once. Atlas had learned the signs long ago. After a few minutes, Ethan straightened his shoulders and rubbed the dog's ears. "Thanks, partner." The dog wagged his tail. Above them, clouds rolled slowly over the peaks of the Rockies. Ethan climbed out of the trench and stretched his stiff back. The sky had turned a dull silver color that meant snow would arrive soon. Atlas jumped up beside him. For a while, they simply stood there together, looking across the valley. Then Ethan picked up the shovel again. The work resumed. Hours passed. The trench grew longer and deeper, inch by inch. But as the afternoon wore on, the ground became harder to break. Frost had sunk deeper into the soil, turning the earth into something closer to stone. Ethan raised the pickaxe again, and again, and again. Finally, the metal tip struck something solid with a loud crack. The vibration ran straight up his arms. He paused. Atlas immediately stepped closer, ears alert. Ethan knelt and brushed away loose dirt. A flat layer of rock lay beneath the frozen soil. He exhaled slowly. "Well," he said, half to himself, "that's new." Breaking through the rock would slow everything down. He swung the pickaxe again. The sound echoed across the quiet valley. Atlas circled the trench edge, watching. After another hour of work, Ethan finally set the tool down and climbed out. The sun was already slipping behind the mountains. Snow had begun falling again, light flakes at first. Atlas shook his coat and trotted toward the cabin. Ethan followed slowly. Halfway across the yard, the wind rose again. Snow swirled through the air in tight spirals. The barn door rattled loudly. Ethan stopped for a moment and looked at the trench behind him. It stretched nearly the entire distance now. Just a few more feet remained. Atlas barked once from the porch, as if urging him forward. Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said, "almost there." That night, the storm strengthened. Wind howled across the ranch, pushing snow through the trees in long, white waves. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled quietly in the stove. Atlas lay on the rug near Ethan's chair, his injured-looking ears twitching at every shift of the wind. Ethan stared into the flames. He could still hear the echoes of the afternoon's memory. The helicopters, the shouting, the dust. Atlas lifted his head. For a moment, their eyes met. Ethan reached down and rested his hand on the dog's neck. "You always know," he said quietly. Atlas's tail moved slowly across the rug. Outside, the wind continued to rise. Winter was tightening its grip on the mountains. And though the trench was nearly finished, the hardest part of Ethan's plan had not even begun yet. Morning arrived under a pale gray sky. The storm that had rattled the valley all night had finally drifted east, leaving behind a thin crust of snow across Ethan Cole's ranch. The mountains looked quiet again,
But Ethan knew better than to trust that calm. Winter in the Rockies never truly rested. It only paused.
Ethan stepped outside just after sunrise. The cold air bit instantly at his face. Atlas trotted out beside him, paws crunching through the snow. The German shepherd stopped at the edge of the trench and looked down into it, ears forward as if inspecting the work they had done together. The trench stretched nearly the entire distance between the cabin and the barn now. Only a few feet remained. Ethan climbed down into the trench and looked at the frozen wall of earth around him. It was deeper than most people would ever bother digging, 5 feet in some places. Tall enough that when he stood inside it, the wind passed overhead instead of cutting straight through him. Atlas jumped down beside him without hesitation. The dog walked ahead slowly, nose close to the ground. The trench curved slightly across the yard where Ethan had avoided the buried rock shelf. Snow dusted the top edges, but down inside the trench, the air felt strangely calmer, quieter. Ethan noticed it immediately. The wind that howled across the open ranch barely touched the bottom of the trench. He nodded slowly. "Good start," he murmured. Atlas looked back at him, tail swaying once. But digging the trench had never been the real goal. Now came the part no one in Silver Creek could see yet. Ethan climbed back out and walked toward the stack of lumber beside the barn. The wood had been delivered weeks earlier, rough beams, weather-resistant planks, and sheets of corrugated metal. Most people assumed he planned to repair the barn roof. They were wrong. Atlas followed closely as Ethan carried the first beam to the trench. He lowered it carefully across the top, testing the width. Then he adjusted it again. Satisfied, Ethan set the beam into place. Atlas sat nearby, watching. "Not just a ditch," Ethan said quietly, almost as if explaining it to the dog. The trench would become a tunnel, a covered passage, protection from the wind, the snow, and the killing cold that turned a simple walk across open ground into a gamble with frostbite. He worked steadily through the morning, one beam after another, each one laid across the trench like ribs over a spine. Atlas walked through the trench beneath them as the frame slowly took shape. Sometimes the dog paused, sniffing the wood or looking upward as if checking the ceiling. The routine reminded Ethan of patrol days. Atlas had always moved ahead first back then, too, checking roads, scanning doorways, listening for danger. The dog still carried that same focus. By midday, the skeleton of the tunnel stretched halfway across the yard. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold. Atlas stood at the far end, watching him quietly. Just then, the distant sound of a pickup truck engine drifted across the valley. Ethan looked up. A dusty blue truck rolled slowly along the road near the fence line. It belonged to Rick Dalton, the largest ranch owner in Silver Creek. Rick slowed the truck until it crawled along beside Ethan's property. He leaned out the window. For a moment, he simply stared at the strange structure forming across the yard. The trench, the beams, the odd covered pathway taking shape between the cabin and the barn. Rick chuckled loudly enough that the sound carried through the cold air. "What the hell are you building, Cole?" he called. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He continued adjusting the beam. Rick laughed again. "You digging yourself a bunker out there?" Still no response. Atlas had moved closer now. The dog stood beside Ethan, eyes fixed on the truck. Rick shook his head. "Man, that war really scrambled you up, didn't it?" The words hung in the air. Ethan slowly stood upright. For a second, It looked like he might respond. But instead, he picked up the next beam and kept working. Rick snorted and drove off, his truck disappearing down the road in a spray of gravel. Atlas remained tense for a moment longer. Then the dog relaxed and walked back toward the trench. Ethan finally exhaled. "Let them laugh," he said quietly. Atlas stepped into the trench and walked its length again. The frame now stretched almost all the way to the barn. Ethan followed behind him. Standing inside the trench beneath the wooden beams, he imagined the finished tunnel. Wood walls, metal roofing, packed earth layered above it all, a shield against the mountain wind. The idea had taken shape slowly over the past few weeks, but now it was real and almost complete. By late afternoon, Ethan laid the final beam into place. Atlas barked once as if acknowledging the moment. Ethan climbed up the ladder and began fastening the metal sheets across the top of the frame. The wind tried to tug them loose, but the structure held firm. One by one, the panels formed a roof. Then came the last step. Ethan shoveled dirt back over the metal, layer after layer. Soon, the entire structure disappeared beneath the earth. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a long mound of dirt crossing the yard. But inside the tunnel felt different. Atlas walked through it first. The dog's paws echoed softly on the packed ground floor. Ethan stepped in behind him. Instantly, the sound of the wind faded. The cold air still lingered, but the biting force of the mountain gusts was gone. The tunnel was quiet, still. Atlas looked back at Ethan with calm eyes. Ethan nodded. "It'll work." The dog wagged his tail. Above them, the sun slipped behind the mountains again. Snow clouds gathered along the horizon. Winter was getting closer. And somewhere far above the Rockies, another storm was already forming. The mountains had a way of whispering their warnings long before people were willing to listen. The morning after Ethan finished covering the tunnel, the air felt different. Not colder, heavier. Ethan noticed it the moment he stepped outside the cabin. The sky above the Rocky Mountains had turned a pale steel color, the kind that made the sun look weak and distant. The wind had slowed, but that silence carried its own kind of tension. Atlas stepped out beside him and immediately lifted his nose to the air. The German shepherd stood still for a long moment. Then he gave a low, uncertain whine. Ethan glanced down at the dog. "You feel it too?" Atlas's ears twitched. Far in the distance, clouds were gathering along the mountain ridges like a slow-moving wall. Ethan had lived in Colorado long enough now to recognize what that meant. Winter wasn't just coming. It was preparing something bigger. He walked toward the barn through the tunnel, moving through the quiet earthen passage they had built together. Inside, the wind disappeared completely. The air held steady, calm, protected by the thick layers of dirt above. Atlas padded ahead, nails clicking softly against the packed floor. When they reached the barn, Ethan pushed open the door and stepped inside. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls. Animals always knew before people did. Ethan checked their water and feed, running his hand along one horse's neck to calm it. Outside, the distant rumble of wind rolled across the valley like a warning drum. By midday, the weather radio on Ethan's kitchen counter began to crackle. A flat voice broke through the static. "Winter storm advisory for the central Rocky Mountain region." Ethan paused while pouring coffee. Atlas raised his head from the rug. "Arctic air mass expected to arrive within 48 hours. Temperatures could fall below -35 degrees Fahrenheit." Ethan slowly set the coffee mug down. "Wind gusts up to 50 miles per hour. Severe whiteout conditions likely." The broadcast ended with a burst of static. For a long moment, the cabin remained silent. Atlas stood and walked over to Ethan. "Guess Winter decided to hurry up," Ethan said quietly. The dog watched him. In town, however, the warning had sparked a different reaction. Silver Creek was small, but news traveled fast. By afternoon, trucks were moving through the streets as ranchers gathered supplies. The grocery store shelves began to empty of canned food and propane. At the hardware store, people talked loudly about the storm. Rick Dalton stood near the counter, shaking his head. "They're saying -35, someone muttered. Rick laughed. "Hell, we've seen worse." A few men nodded. Then another voice spoke. "What about that veteran up on the ridge?" Rick smirked. "You mean Cole?" "Yeah." Rick leaned against the counter. "That guy's been digging holes in his yard for a month. If that storm hits the way they say it will," he shrugged, "he ain't making it through the week." A few uneasy chuckles followed. No one in town had actually seen Ethan's tunnel from the inside. All they knew was that he'd spent weeks digging a strange trench across his property. And to most of them, that was enough proof that the war had left him broken. Back on the ranch, Ethan worked steadily through the afternoon. He stacked extra firewood beside the cabin, checked the barn doors, reinforced a loose section of fence. Atlas followed him everywhere, never more than a few feet away. The dog sensed the change in the air. The wind returned shortly before sunset. Not violent yet, but steady. Cold. It whispered through the pine trees along the ridge and pushed snow across the open pasture in thin white sheets. Ethan stood at the entrance to the tunnel and looked across the valley. Clouds now covered the mountains completely. Atlas stood beside him. "You remember Kandahar?" Ethan said quietly. The dog tilted his head. "We used to get those warnings over the radio. Dust storms coming in fast." Atlas wagged his tail once. Ethan looked back at the tunnel. The mound of earth stretched quietly across the yard. Simple. Ugly. Easy to laugh at. But he understood the mountains. He understood wind. And he understood what cold could do to a human body caught outside. "Let them laugh," he murmured. Atlas nudged his hand. Night arrived quickly. The first real gusts of the coming storm slammed into the side of the cabin just after midnight. Snow began falling harder, rattling against the windows like handfuls of thrown gravel. Atlas stood at the window, watching. Ethan added another log to the fire. The flames flickered warmly inside the small room. Outside, the mountains were beginning to disappear into darkness and blowing snow. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the storm was gathering its full strength. And when it arrived in Silver Creek, it would test every ranch, every barn, every road, and every man who believed he understood winter. The storm arrived before dawn. Ethan Cole woke to a sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. The cabin walls groaned under the pressure of the wind, and loose snow rattled across the roof like 1,000 tiny stones. The darkness beyond the window was not really darkness at all. It was white. A shifting, living white that moved across the glass in wild bursts. Atlas was already awake. The German shepherd stood near the door, body tense, ears forward, listening to the storm as if it were an approaching enemy. His eyes were fixed on the crack beneath the door where wind pressed fine snow into the cabin in a thin silver line. Ethan sat up slowly. The air inside the cabin was warm from the small iron stove, but even through the thick log walls he could feel the violence outside. The whole place seemed to breathe under the force of the wind. He looked at the thermometer hanging beside the door.
-22 degrees, and falling. He swung his legs to the floor and pulled on his boots. Atlas never took his eyes off the door. "You hear it too, huh?" Ethan said quietly. Atlas let out a low sound in his throat, not quite a bark, not quite a growl. Outside, the blizzard deepened.
The wind struck the cabin in long, brutal waves. Snow blew sideways, fast enough to erase the shape of the yard and blur the outline of the barn. Somewhere beyond the porch, something loose banged once, then again, swallowed by the storm. Ethan stepped closer to the window and wiped a circle in the frost with the side of his hand. The barn was barely visible, just a shadow in white chaos. 70 feet away. In weather like this, it may as well have been across the mountain. He opened the door a crack. The cold rushed in like water from a broken dam. Wind shoved hard against the wood, forcing Ethan to brace himself with one shoulder. Snow sprayed inside and skittered across the floorboards. He caught only a glimpse of the yard before he pushed the door shut again. Whiteout. Total. He turned to Atlas. "We've got to check the horses." Atlas was already moving. Ethan grabbed the lantern from its hook, though he knew the tunnel mattered more than the light. Without that trench, without the covered passage they had built together, this would have been a dangerous walk. In this storm, it might even have been a fatal one. He lifted the latch and opened the inner door that led to the tunnel entrance. At once, the difference was clear. The roar of the storm remained above and outside, but here the sound fell away into a muffled, distant thunder. The lantern threw a warm circle over the earthen walls and the narrow, packed floor stretching toward the barn. The tunnel did not feel warm exactly, but it felt still, protected, human. Atlas moved ahead first, confident and focused, nails clicking softly on the floor. Ethan followed, lantern raised. The further they went, the more unreal the contrast felt. Above them, the Rocky Mountain winter was trying to bury the ranch under snow and wind. But down here, the air barely moved. Dirt and timber and steel had turned a killing storm into little more than a sound overhead. When Ethan pushed open the barnside door, the horses were waiting. Their eyes rolled toward him, and steam rose from their nostrils in thick white clouds. They had been uneasy long before dawn. Animals always knew when the weather crossed the line from rough to dangerous. "Easy," Ethan said, stepping inside. Atlas moved along the stalls, alert and calm, as if checking each corner one by one. Ethan added hay, checked the water, tested the latches on the barn doors, and ran a steadying hand along the neck of the nearest horse. The animal's muscles trembled under the skin. Outside, the wind screamed against the boards hard enough to make the whole structure shudder. Inside, Ethan worked quickly. He secured a loose chain, lowered an extra blanket over one stall, and listened. That was when he heard it. Not from the barn, from farther away. A faint metallic bang carried through the storm. He frowned. Another sound followed, this time sharper. Then nothing. He stood still for a moment, listening over the wind. Atlas turned toward the yard, ears upright. Something out there was failing. Ethan moved back into the tunnel with Atlas at his side. As soon as the barn door closed behind them, the quiet returned. He stopped halfway through and held the lantern high, studying the beams overhead. Everything looked solid. The roof timbers were holding. The dirt above them sat packed and heavy, but stable. For a moment, he felt relief. The system was working. The tunnel had done exactly what he'd hoped. It had shielded the walk, blocked the wind, and protected the one stretch of open ground that had nearly taken him down in the first storm.
But storms like this did not test only one man. By late afternoon, the valley had disappeared completely. At the Dalton Ranch, one of the outer barn doors blew off its hinge and slammed into a drift. At another property lower in the valley, a chicken coop collapsed under wet snow.
Somewhere on the road toward town, a truck slid halfway into a ditch and had to be abandoned. Nobody could move easily now. Nobody could see far enough to trust what was in front of them. The weather radio crackled once, then went silent. Silver Creek was on its own. Inside Ethan's cabin, the little stove glowed steadily. Atlas lay on the rug, but he never fully relaxed. His head lifted at every shift of the wind, every groan in the walls. Ethan sat at the table with a mug of coffee gone cold in his hands, listening to the storm and the strange silence between its bursts. The thermometer dropped again. -29. Then -32. The cabin remained warm, not hot, but livable, safe. Ethan glanced toward the tunnel door. Without it, he would have been trapped by fear every time the horses needed checking. Without it, every trip outside would have been a fresh gamble against frostbite, disorientation, and the old panic that storm noise sometimes woke inside him. With it, the ranch still felt connected. Cabin to barn, shelter to shelter, life to life. Even so, the mountain was not done with them. Night came early, swallowed by storm clouds and flying snow. The last hint of daylight vanished long before sunset. The world outside was reduced to sound alone. Then, sometime after dark, Atlas stood up so suddenly the rug slid beneath him. Ethan looked up. The dog stared toward the tunnel entrance. A second later, Ethan heard it too. A low, cracking sound. Not from the cabin walls, from somewhere inside the tunnel. Atlas gave a sharp bark and ran to the inner door. Ethan was already on his feet with the lantern in hand. When he opened the tunnel door, the muffled quiet greeted him again, but now something was different. The stillness felt strained. He could hear soft noises ahead, tiny shifts, faint trickles of dirt. He moved quickly, Atlas in front of him. Halfway to the barn, the lantern light found the problem. One section of the tunnel roof had bowed down slightly under the enormous weight of drifting snow above. A timber beam was still holding, but barely. The dirt along one side had loosened and begun to spill down in a slow, thin stream. Ethan's jaw tightened. The blizzard outside had piled too much on one section, too fast. Another sharp crack echoed through the passage. Atlas barked again. Then a clump of frozen earth dropped from above and struck the floor hard enough to send dust through the lantern light. Ethan moved forward fast, raising the lantern. "Back!" he called instinctively. Atlas jumped to the side, but not far enough. A second piece of packed dirt and snow broke loose from the sagging section and came down near the beam. It was not a full collapse, not yet, but it was heavy enough to slam against Atlas's front leg. The dog yelped. The sound tore straight through Ethan. "Atlas!" He dropped to one knee at once. Atlas tried to step back, but his front paw gave way beneath him. He caught himself, breathing hard, ears pinned back. Dirt streaked his shoulders and muzzle. Another groan rolled overhead. Ethan set the lantern down and brushed the loose soil away with both hands. He ran his fingers carefully over the dog's leg, checking for the worst. No blood, but pain. Real pain. Atlas whined once, then licked Ethan's wrist as if trying to calm him instead. "Easy, buddy," Ethan whispered. "Easy. I've got you." The tunnel creaked again.
Snow shifted above them with a deep, heavy hush. They could not stay here. Ethan slid one arm beneath Atlas's chest and another beneath his body, lifting the dog carefully. Atlas was a big shepherd, solid and muscular, but adrenaline made the weight mean nothing. The lantern shook in Ethan's hand as he rose. He looked once at the sagging section above. Still holding. Barely. He turned and moved back toward the cabin as fast as he could without jarring the dog in his arms.
Behind them, the blizzard roared above the mountain of dirt and snow. Ahead, a thin ribbon of lamplight waited under the cabin door. When Ethan stepped back inside, warmth wrapped around them, but fear came with it. He laid Atlas gently on the rug near the stove and knelt beside him. Outside, winter kept raging. Inside, Ethan realized the truth with cold clarity. The tunnel had saved them from the storm. But the storm had found a way to strike back. And now, Atlas was hurt. The cabin felt smaller than it had ever felt before. Outside, the blizzard continued to roar across the mountains, shaking the walls and burying the ranch deeper beneath drifting snow. Inside, the only sounds were the crackling of the stove and Atlas's uneven breathing. Ethan knelt beside him on the floor. The German shepherd lay on the thick rug near the fire, one front leg stretched forward awkwardly. Dirt still clung to his fur from the tunnel collapse, and his chest rose and fell faster than usual. Ethan ran his hands carefully along the injured leg again. Atlas winced. "Easy, easy, buddy," Ethan murmured. Years in the army had taught Ethan more than how to fire a rifle or survive in the desert. Field injuries had been common. Sometimes it was soldiers. Sometimes it was the dogs that worked beside them. He moved slowly, feeling for the exact place where the pain came from. The bone felt intact. No sharp break. Probably a bad bruise. Maybe a strain. Still painful enough to stop Atlas from putting weight on it. Ethan exhaled quietly. "Could have been worse," he whispered. Atlas lifted his head and watched him. Even injured, the dog's eyes stayed steady and alert, the same eyes that had once scanned roadside shadows thousands of miles away. Ethan brought out a small first aid kit from the cabinet. Gauze, bandage wrap, antiseptic. He cleaned the dirt from Atlas's leg and wrapped it carefully. The dog didn't fight him, didn't growl or pull away. Atlas simply lay there, trusting him completely. When the bandage was finished, Ethan sat back on his heels. For a long moment, he just looked at the dog. "You always take the hit first," he said quietly. Atlas thumped his tail once against the rug. The storm raged louder outside. A violent gust struck the cabin wall, making the window frame shudder. Snow rattled against the glass like handfuls of thrown gravel. Ethan stood and walked to the window. He wiped a clear circle through the frost. Nothing but white. The barn had vanished completely. 70 feet away and invisible. He checked the thermometer again. -38 degrees. The cold had dropped faster than even the weather radio predicted. If the tunnel collapsed further, reaching the barn again might become impossible. The thought sat heavy in his chest. Behind him, Atlas tried to stand. His injured leg buckled. He caught himself with the other three and remained upright, though his balance looked uncertain. Ethan turned immediately. "Hey, no," he said gently. Atlas limped toward the door. The dog's nose pressed against the lower crack where cold air leaked through. Then Atlas looked back at Ethan. He gave a short bark, not loud, but insistent. Ethan frowned. "You want to go back out there?"
Atlas barked again. Ethan hesitated. The storm outside was still dangerous, but something about Atlas's posture felt different. The dog wasn't restless. He was focused, listening. Ethan held still. And then he heard it too. A faint, distant sound carried through the storm. A dull, thudding noise. Irregular. Not wind, not wood. Something moving. Ethan stepped closer to the door. The sound came again. A weak, metallic banging. From the direction of the barn. His stomach tightened. One of the barn doors must have loosened. If the wind ripped it open completely, the horses could panic. Or worse, the drifting snow could bury the entrance entirely. Ethan looked down at Atlas. "You heard that before I did, didn't you?" Atlas's tail flicked. Even injured, the dog was ready. Ethan grabbed his coat again. "All right," he said quietly. "But you stay behind me this time." He opened the inner door leading to the tunnel. The difference was immediate again. Outside, the blizzard howled like an angry ocean. Inside the tunnel, the air felt still and close. Ethan lifted the lantern. Atlas limped beside him, slower now, but determined. Halfway through the tunnel, Ethan's heart began to pound harder. The damaged section creaked above them. Loose dirt had fallen across the floor. But the main beam still held. "Hold together," Ethan muttered under his breath. They moved past the weakened spot carefully. Atlas stayed close, leaning slightly against Ethan's leg as they walked. When they reached the barn door, the noise became clear. One of the outer barn doors had blown partially open. The wind slammed it again and again against the frame. Each impact echoed through the storm. Ethan stepped inside quickly. Snow had already begun blowing across the barn floor. The horses stamped nervously in their stalls. "Easy," Ethan said, moving to the door. The wind fought him as he pulled the heavy wood panel closed again. The gusts tried to rip it from his grip, but he forced the latch into place and secured the chain. The banging stopped. Inside the barn, the sudden quiet felt almost unreal. Atlas sat down near the entrance, breathing steadily despite the pain in his leg. Ethan walked over and knelt beside him. "You could have stayed warm back there," he said softly. Atlas looked up at him. For a moment, the storm outside seemed very far away. Ethan scratched the dog gently behind the ears. "Just like the old days, huh?" Atlas wagged his tail slowly. Together they walked back through the tunnel once more. Behind them, the blizzard continued to bury the valley in snow and darkness. But inside the tunnel, and inside the small cabin waiting at the other end, there was still warmth, still life, and the quiet loyalty of a dog who refused to leave his soldier behind. Morning came slowly to the mountains, not with sunlight, but with silence. Sometime during the early hours, the blizzard finally began to weaken. The violent wind that had hammered the valley all night slowly faded into a low, restless whisper moving across the drifts. Ethan Cole woke in his chair beside the stove. He had fallen asleep sometime before dawn, boots still on, one arm resting on the table. The fire had burned low, but the cabin remained warm. Atlas slept on the rug nearby. His bandaged legs stretched carefully forward, the rest of his body curled toward the stove. Even asleep, the German shepherd faced the door, always watching. Ethan stood slowly and stretched his stiff back. The first thing he noticed was the quiet. After a night of roaring wind and pounding snow, the silence felt strange, almost fragile. He walked to the window. The frost had thickened on the glass overnight. When he wiped it away, the outside world appeared again. The ranch had disappeared. Snow covered everything. The fence posts were nearly buried. The open yard between the cabin and barn had become a smooth white slope, shaped by the wind into strange rolling waves. But the barn was still standing. Ethan exhaled. He looked down at the thermometer beside the door. -37 degrees. The storm had passed, but the cold remained. He stirred the stove, adding fresh logs, then knelt beside Atlas. The dog lifted his head. "You hanging in there?" Ethan asked quietly. Atlas wagged his tail slowly. Ethan checked the bandage on the injured leg. The swelling had not grown worse. "That's good," Ethan said softly. Atlas licked his hand once. Outside, the valley remained silent. Snowdrifts were piled deep across the land, some nearly waist-high. Anyone trying to cross the open yard this morning would sink immediately. Without the tunnel, reaching the barn would have been nearly impossible. Ethan pulled on his coat and lifted the lantern. "Let's check the horses." Atlas stood carefully. His injured leg touched the floor lightly, but held. The two of them walked to the tunnel entrance. When Ethan opened the inner door, the familiar calm greeted them again. The tunnel was dim and still, the packed earth walls holding the quiet like a shield against the frozen world above. Atlas moved ahead slowly. Ethan followed. Halfway down the tunnel, Ethan stopped. Something about the air felt different, warmer. Not by much, but enough to notice. He raised the lantern and studied the ceiling. The damaged beam from the night before still sagged slightly, but it had not collapsed further. Dirt had settled across the floor beneath it, forming a small mound. The structure had held. "Good," Ethan murmured. Atlas walked past the weakened section carefully. When they reached the barn door, Ethan pushed it open. Inside, the horses stood calmly in their stalls. The storm had frightened them during the night, but now they seemed settled again. Ethan moved through the barn, checking the feed and water. The animals snorted softly as he passed, their warm breath clouding the cold air. Everything looked intact, nothing broken, nothing buried. He finished the checks and turned back toward the tunnel. As he stepped inside again, the strange warmth returned. It wasn't heat, but compared to the deadly air outside, the tunnel felt almost comfortable. The packed earth overhead was doing exactly what he had hoped, holding the cold back. Atlas limped along beside him. When they reached the cabin door, Ethan pushed it open. A rush of warm air spilled into the tunnel. Atlas walked inside first. Ethan stepped in after him and closed the door. At that exact moment, the distant sound of an engine broke the silence outside. Ethan froze. Atlas lifted his head. The noise grew louder. A vehicle, struggling, grinding through deep snow somewhere down the road. Ethan walked quickly to the window. A pickup truck was slowly crawling up the narrow mountain road toward the ranch. County sheriff markings were barely visible beneath a layer of frozen snow. The truck fought its way through the drifts until it finally stopped near the gate. A man climbed out. Deputy Mark Harris. Ethan recognized him from town. The deputy waded through knee-deep snow toward the cabin, each step slow and heavy. A few minutes later, he reached the porch and knocked hard on the door. Ethan opened it. Cold air surged inside. The deputy stared at him for a long moment. Then his eyes moved past Ethan, into the cabin. Confusion spread across his face. "You, alive?" the deputy said. Ethan blinked. "Last time I checked."
The deputy stepped inside and shut the door behind him. Snow melted instantly from his boots. He looked around the room, at the stove, at the dry wood stacked by the wall, at Atlas resting on the rug. Then he looked at the thermometer hanging beside the door. 65 degrees. His eyes widened. He stepped back toward the window and glanced outside again. The valley still sat under brutal sub-zero cold. -37. Yet inside the cabin, it was warm. The deputy shook his head slowly. How the hell? His voice trailed off. Then he noticed the open door to the tunnel. Curiosity pulled him toward it. He stepped into the entrance and stopped. The earth-covered passage stretched quietly toward the barn. No wind, no blowing snow, just still air beneath layers of dirt and timber. The deputy turned back toward Ethan. You built this? Ethan nodded once. The man stood silent for several seconds. Finally, he said quietly, You know, half the town thought that trench meant you'd lost your mind. Ethan shrugged. Atlas lifted his head and looked toward the tunnel. The deputy stared at the structure again. Then he spoke softly, almost to himself. Turns out you might be the only one who understood this winter. Deputy Mark Harris stood in the entrance of the tunnel for a long moment. The wind outside howled across the ranch, but inside the narrow passage, the air was calm and quiet. The lantern light from the cabin stretched a few feet down the packed earth floor, revealing the wooden beams overhead and the dirt walls that held the cold at bay. The deputy ran his gloved hand slowly along the tunnel wall. Earth insulation, he muttered. Ethan said nothing. Atlas rested on the rug behind them, watching both men carefully. The German shepherd's injured leg was stretched forward, but his ears were alert, tracking every sound. The deputy stepped back into the cabin. You realize something, Cole? He said. Ethan leaned against the wooden table. What's that? Most folks in Silver Creek spent the whole week laughing about that trench you were digging. Ethan shrugged once. The deputy gave a short breath of disbelief. And now half the valley can't even reach their barns without risking frostbite. He walked to the window and wiped away a circle of frost. Outside, the valley lay buried beneath towering drifts of snow. The road had vanished completely. Even the fence lines were barely visible. The deputy shook his head slowly. Rick Dalton nearly lost 3 horses last night, he said. Ethan looked up. Wind ripped one of his barn doors open during the storm. Took them hours to get it shut. Atlas lifted his head. The deputy turned back toward the tunnel again. You walked to your barn through that thing in the middle of the blizzard, didn't you? Ethan nodded. Several times. The deputy let out a low whistle. Hell of an idea. For a few seconds, the room fell quiet. Then the deputy pulled his radio from his jacket. Static hissed through the speaker. County Dispatch, this is Harris, he said. The signal struggled against the storm interference, but a voice eventually answered. Harris, we copy. What's the situation up there? The deputy looked around the cabin once more before replying. Cole Ranch is secure. Cabin's warm, barn's intact. He paused. Then he added, And you might want to tell the others something. What's that? Harris looked directly at Ethan. That trench everyone laughed about? It's the only reason this place is still running. Static crackled across the radio again. Copy that, the voice said. The deputy clipped the radio back to his belt. Atlas slowly stood and walked toward the tunnel entrance, testing his bandaged leg. He moved carefully, but the limp had already begun to improve. Ethan watched him.
Easy, buddy. Atlas stopped beside him. The deputy smiled slightly. That dog's tougher than most people I know. Ethan reached down and scratched behind Atlas's ears. He's had good training. Outside, the wind continued sweeping across the valley, though the worst of the storm had passed. The deputy pulled on his gloves. I should head back before the road freezes worse, he said. He stepped onto the porch and looked once more across the ranch. The mound of earth covering the tunnel stretched between the cabin and the barn like a long, sleeping animal beneath the snow. Yesterday, most of Silver Creek had called it madness. Now it looked like something else entirely. Something practical. Something smart. The deputy turned back toward Ethan. You know what's going to happen once people hear about this? Ethan shrugged. They'll probably stop laughing. The deputy chuckled. More than that. He nodded toward the tunnel. They're going to start digging. Atlas wagged his tail once. The deputy climbed back into his truck and slowly forced the vehicle through the deep snow toward the road. Ethan stood on the porch beside Atlas and watched the truck disappear into the drifting white. For the first time since the storm began, the valley felt calm again.
The sky above the Rocky Mountains slowly began to clear. Sunlight touched the snow-covered ridges in pale gold. Behind them, the quiet tunnel waited beneath the earth. A simple idea, a stubborn piece of work, and the reason two survivors had made it safely through the worst winter storm Silver Creek had seen in years. But by morning, the entire valley would know the name of the man they once mocked, and they would come to see the trench that saved him. Morning sunlight spread slowly across the Rocky Mountains. After 2 days of violent wind and endless snow, the sky above Silver Creek finally cleared. The valley looked like a different world now. Snow lay thick across every field and road, turning fences into white ridges and burying old paths beneath smooth, frozen waves. From the porch of his cabin, Ethan Cole watched the light crawl across the hills. Atlas sat beside him. The German shepherd's bandaged leg rested carefully in the snow, but the dog seemed stronger already. His ears twitched at every distant sound, and his eyes followed the movement of birds returning to the quiet sky. For the first time since the storm began, the valley was peaceful. No wind, no drifting snow, just sunlight and silence. Ethan took a slow breath. Looks like we made it, he said quietly. Atlas's tail brushed against the wooden porch. Down in the valley below, a small column of smoke began rising from a ranch chimney. Then another, and another. Life was returning. But the road leading up the ridge toward Ethan's ranch still lay buried under heavy drifts. Around mid-morning, the first truck finally appeared. It moved slowly, pushing through the packed snow with chains rattling on the tires. The vehicle climbed the narrow ridge road until it reached Ethan's gate. Then it stopped. Rick Dalton stepped out. The big rancher stood for a moment, looking across Ethan's property. His eyes moved from the cabin to the barn, and finally to the long mound of earth stretching between them. The trench. Rick trudged through the snow until he reached the porch. Ethan said nothing. Atlas watched him carefully. Rick pulled off his gloves and cleared his throat. Heard from the deputy this morning, he said. Ethan leaned against the railing. Rick nodded toward the barn. Storm nearly tore our doors off down there last night. Ethan waited. Rick looked at the mound of earth again. You walked through that thing during the blizzard? Several times. Rick let out a long breath.
For a moment he seemed uncomfortable, as if searching for the right words. Finally he said quietly, "Guess I owe you an apology." Ethan shrugged. Rick glanced down at Atlas. "That dog all right?" "Just bruised." Atlas wagged his tail slowly. Rick studied the tunnel entrance near the cabin door. "You mind if I see it?" Ethan nodded once. Rick stepped inside the tunnel. The moment he entered, his expression changed. The wind outside was still bitterly cold, but down in the tunnel, the air felt calm and steady. The earth walls held the temperature, blocking the harsh mountain gusts. Rick walked slowly toward the middle. "No wind," he muttered. He touched the packed dirt wall with one hand. Warmer, too. Ethan followed behind him with Atlas limping carefully beside them. Rick reached the barn entrance and stepped back out into the open snow. He turned slowly toward Ethan. "That's smart," he admitted. Ethan said nothing. Rick shook his head once. "You might have just solved a problem every rancher around here has been fighting for 50 years. Word traveled fast in small mountain towns. By the afternoon, 2 more trucks arrived. Then another. Neighbors from across the valley came climbing up the ridge to see the strange trench they had once laughed about. Some walked through the tunnel quietly. Others studied the beams and dirt overhead.
No one laughed now. They spoke in low voices, measuring distances with their eyes. Rick Dalton stood near the entrance, shaking his head in disbelief. Maggie Lawson arrived later that afternoon with a thermos of coffee. She smiled warmly when she saw Ethan. "Told them you weren't crazy," she said. Atlas wagged his tail when she scratched behind his ears. The sun slowly dipped toward the mountains again, casting long golden shadows across the snow. By evening, the trucks began leaving one by one. But the conversations continued down in Silver Creek. About trenches, about tunnels, about how the earth beneath their feet might be the best protection from the brutal winters that returned every year. Weeks later, when the snow began melting, the first new trench appeared at another ranch. Then another. By spring, half the valley had started digging their own tunnels between homes and barns. People began calling them coal tunnels. Ethan didn't ask for the name. He didn't argue either. One quiet evening, long after the storm had passed, Ethan sat on the porch with Atlas beside him. The snow was melting along the hillsides now. Water trickled slowly beneath the fence lines, and the valley looked alive again. Atlas's leg had healed. The German shepherd stood and stretched, then trotted toward the tunnel entrance as he had done 1,000 times before. Ethan followed. Inside the tunnel, the air remained calm and steady. At the far end, the barn door stood open to the warm light of sunset. Ethan rested a hand briefly on Atlas's back. "Turns out," he said softly, "we didn't have to fight winter." Atlas looked up at him. Ethan smiled. "We just had to understand it." Together, they walked through the tunnel toward the barn, their footsteps echoing softly beneath the earth. The same tunnel that once made a whole town laugh. And the same tunnel that had carried them safely through the coldest storm Silver Creek had seen in years. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear from you. Sometimes the strongest thing in the world isn't a building or a plan or even a storm. Sometimes it's loyalty. A man who refuses to give up. And a dog who refuses to leave his side. So before you go, try something simple. If you believe loyalty like Atlas showed still exists in this world, just type 1 in the comments. If you believe every veteran deserves a loyal friend like that, type 0.
You don't need to write anything else, just a 1 or a 0. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because there are many more powerful stories about veterans, loyal dogs, and the quiet strength that helps people survive the hardest moments of life. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.